May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of our hearts, the meditations of our hearts be ever acceptable unto you, O God, our strength and our deliverer. Amen.
Amen.
Yesterday, 3 Russian cosmonauts boarded the International Space Station in Ukrainian colors. Their names are Denis Matveyev, Oleg Artemyev, and Sergei Kasakov. They docked at the ISS, that is the International Space Station, after 3 hours of a flight which blasted off from a Russian-owned facility in Kazakhstan. Now, the standard issue of the Russian uniform for the International Space Station is blue. And at least one of them was seen wearing this blue outfit at takeoff in Kazakhstan. Now, on arrival at the International Space Station, all of them were in yellow with a little bit of blue. One of them, Oleg Artemyev, explained their peculiar choice of color this way. It became our turn to pick a color. We had accumulated a lot of yellow material, and so we needed to use it, he joked. That's why we had to wear yellow. And they were welcomed aboard the ISS. They hugged and greeted with their fellow cosmonauts, Americans, the Germans, and everybody who was there at the International Space Station. Now, it seems to me that peace and friendship at the present moment is something that is so out of this world. It is so out of this world that it needs to be enacted by cosmonauts in outer space rather than by politicians on planet Earth. But what do we do when all we see around us is disaster? What do we do and say when we start counting the number of disasters, human and natural and otherwise, that we see? The Ukrainian humanitarian crisis, COVID-19, and currently the South Korean wildfires and the dry weather and strong winds, floods in Australia, 2 recent winter fires in Colorado, Brazilian mudslides, super typhoon called Typhoon Rai in the Philippines, Venezuelan humanitarian and refugee crisis, the wealth gaps that we see in the world, the crises that we see in our country, and the coup d'etat attempts on our continent. So many disasters that we see around us. What do we do? What do we say? What do we do when on a Sunday like this we are told of stories of people, Galileans, whose blood was mixed with their sacrifices, killed and their blood mixed with the sacrifices, that brutal act. And we're told, we hear stories of 18 people who were killed by a falling tower, 23,000 that died in the wilderness from our New Testament reading. What do we do when all we hear around us is disaster, loss of life? It be natural, or what you might consider natural, or it be human caused. Now, there are a number of ways, and I'm just counting a few that occurred to me as I read all of these things in the news and also read the Gospel reading and both the New Testament and Old Testament reading. That we've got a number of options of how to respond to these. One is we try to come up with an explanation. Why does evil happen? Why do disasters happen? Why do these things happen? And you try to find cool-headed explanations, kind of objective way of explaining what's happening, whether we use science or we follow an ideological way of thinking, or we look at how history has developed, because the human mind has this problem that we can't take gaps in our thinking. So, we want an answer of one sort or another. Rather a bad answer than none at all. We seem to not be able to relax when there is no explanation for whatever is around us. So first response might be to want an explanation. Another response, option 2, might be to want to apportion blame. Like, who did this? What caused that? Sometimes we want to apportion blame to the person who causes suffering, but there are times when we look at those who are suffering as causing their own problems, their own disastrous situations. And so that's what we kind of see in today's gospel reading. People come to Jesus asking him to help them answer give some kind of explanation for what happened to these Galileans that whose blood Pilate mixed with their sacrifices, and about the tower that just fell, just recently fallen on 18 people and killed them. And Jesus, in a sense, he doesn't argue against or for, but he kind of just accepts the usual theological framework that would be used when things like that happen, that bad things happen to bad people. That if you sin, something horrible happens to you. It's a punishment or something like that. But as we read on, you realize that he does something beyond that. He asks them, do you think that those whose blood was mixed with our sacrifices and those who had a tower fall on them, do you think that they were worse sinners than you? Not necessarily, but if you continue down a path that is not of God, the same will happen to you. So he's trying to say, don't relax with this answer either. Don't put yourself out of the equation. Don't just apportion blame when you fell on them because of horrible people. Good, I'm a good person. No. He's saying, well, look, you might need to think a bit further. Their response is not that different from that which Job in the Old Testament, remember Job who boils and lost his family and his estate was burnt into ash and smoke, wife died, lost everything. Three of his friends are trying to explain why what happened to him. The three friends, the first three friends, use the same kind of theological argument. You must have done something wrong. That's why all these horrible things are happening to you. So that's sort of option 2. Onto apportion blame. Option 3, when we fail to find answers, it's very easy then to slide into despondency and depression and pessimism. We start thinking the times are just crazy. There's nothing that we can do to try and explain them, and there's nothing that we can do to improve things. And so we stay depressed, pessimistic, and overwhelmed. Now, these are not separate options. Sometimes they happen all together at once. I'm sure we've all been there. You get a bit of explanation there. So this one is responsible for that. But also there's this, it could be this, the times are just horrible and there's nothing we can do. Now, what Jesus does, he seems to want to push us beyond this by shocking our system. Because his response to those who are listening to him, it's very easy to think that Jesus was very heartless in his response. If people have just died, he tells us we need to repent. Right? But in a sense, I think what he's doing is he's trying to shock their system and say, you want an explanation, you want to apportion blame, and maybe you're despondent. Now let's turn this thing around to yourselves. Disasters. These disasters have happened. Let's turn the gaze. What needs to happen with you? Jesus says, bear fruit, basically. Because what he does is he responds to them, and then he closes his response with a parable. There is a priest in the Church of England. He's an author, and I've had the opportunity to meet him. He almost became my spiritual director, but then the Church of England decided to move him. His name is Mark Oakley, Canon Mark Oakley. He has this thing that he likes to say when it comes to parables. He says, parables are not meant to make sense. They are meant to make you. Parables are not there to answer your questions, but they're there to shape you and me. And so Jesus closes his response with something that seems to say, now what is it that needs to happen with you before we start talking about all the horrors that happen around the world? And he talks about a fig tree, which for 3 years hasn't borne any fruit. He doesn't say whether it has to do with bad weather, or it was neglected, or it was just not bearing fruit. And on the one hand, the owner of the vineyard says, cut it, throw it out. And the gardener says, give me 1 more year, let me tend it, and let's see if it produces fruit. And if it doesn't, then we can cut it out. Okay? What is it that this parable might be saying to us in the midst of disasters? Trying to come up with explanations, trying to apportion blame and despondency is quite natural. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it. But the question that arises is, why am I in this world? What is it that needs to happen then? How do I respond to this as me being me? I think what that parable is saying, what it's trying to make out of us is to say, continue to be what God has always wanted you to be. That might be the only hope in the midst of disaster, to bear fruit. And here I can't help it but think of Galatians 5:22, the 9 fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I have a 10th one that I'd like to throw in the mix, and that's humor. Like the cosmonauts in outer space, when they're asked, this is a huge political statement, and all they say is, oh, we had yellow material and we sewed it together and made these uniforms, ha ha ha. I'm not sure what will happen to them once they come from outer space and back to Earth. I'm not sure how Putin is going to treat them. But in a sense, it gives some kind of hope to say we can use opportunities to rehumanize ourselves. And God's way of saying rehumanize is a fruit of the Spirit, because I do firmly believe that God created us to be a people who bear this fruit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, under all sorts of circumstances. And so I think that this is a fourth option that Jesus presents us with. When you are faced with typhoons, with wildfire, COVID-19, and explanations cannot answer everything, and apportioning blame is not enough, and despondency seems to be at our doorstep, Jesus says, maybe let's look at ourselves. Not blame anybody, not blame ourselves. Well, we could, but the important thing is to work on our rehumanization under those difficult circumstances. He calls us to be transformed. If we go and read them, the New Testament reading, the Israelites were baptized by the crossing through the Red Sea and fed with water from the rock that was just Christ. So using the sacraments, you could say, baptism and the Eucharist, to keep being fed and mulched, so that even in the middle of disaster, we still hold on to this, what it means to be human. We don't want to be dehumanized by disaster. We want to stay even more human and be what God has created us to be. So that becomes something of a fourth option. Or as Isaiah in the first reading says, come and get that which is free, that which money can't buy, and that is God's grace. That's why we have the sacraments. Wafers and wine do cost something, but actually the grace that comes with them costs nothing. Be rehumanized by the gifts of God. Be made whole by that, even in the middle of disaster. So maybe at one point we might have a kind of witty thinking that those three cosmonauts had in outer space, showing friendship that is difficult to accomplish at the moment on planet Earth. But this also brought to mind something that C.S. Lewis, an author of Narnia, ventures there, but also what in the Anglican Church and in many other backgrounds is called a literary theologian. He doesn't come up with arguments, but he comes with stories that actually speak powerfully and theologically. He once wrote this, and I think that this is important for us to take in today, because we don't know who's going to push that button and that nuclear bomb goes off and we're all in trouble. Under similar circumstances, this is what C.S. Lewis wrote. In one way, we think a great deal too much of the atomic bomb. So how are we to live in an atomic age? I'm tempted to reply, why? As you would have lived in the 16th century when the plague visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in a Viking age when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat at any time and in the night. Or indeed, as you are already living in an age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of air raids, an age of railway accidents, and an age of motor accidents. In other words, do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Believe me, dear sir or madam, you and all whom you love already were sentenced to death before the atomic bomb was invented. And a quite high percentage of us were going to die in unpleasant ways. We had indeed one very great advantage over our ancestors, and that is anesthetics, painkillers. But we have that still. It is perfectly ridiculous to go about whimpering and drawing long faces because the scientists have added one more chance of painfully and prematurely killing us. but we are not different. This is the first point to be made, and the first action to be taken, and that is to pull ourselves together. If we are all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things. Praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to our friends over a pint and a game of darts. Not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies. A microbe can do that. We know that with COVID. But they need not dominate our minds. It sounds like something that says, well, maybe ignore what's happening, but I don't think that's what he's saying. And what he's saying is, hope is in being human again, even in the midst of disaster, being what we are created to be, even bathing our children, or sharing a pint in a pub, or shooting darts. That strikes me as something similar to what these cosmonauts did at the International Space Station. And so the question that I asked in the beginning, I asked it once more. What do we do when disaster is all we see around us?